Je suis vraiment très heureux qu'on reçoive Carolyn Drake ce soir. Carolyn Drake est une photographe américaine, née en Californie, et qui est aujourd'hui membre de l'agence Magnum. Elle a étudié les médias, la culture et l'histoire à l'université de Brown aux États-Unis. Et puis elle a travaillé pendant quelques années dans des compagnies dans ce domaine-là, culture, médias, à New York. Et puis à un moment, à l'âge de 30 ans, elle a décidé de devenir photographe et d'en faire vraiment le cœur de son activité. Dans les années 2000, entre 2007 et 2013, elle a habité à Istanbul, qui est devenu une sorte de camp de base à partir duquel elle rayonnait pour aller photographier, réaliser divers projets qui l'intéressaient. Elle était beaucoup en Chine, en Ukraine, en Russie, au Moyen-Orient. Et elle a, à cette époque-là, réalisé plusieurs photobooks, plusieurs livres de photographie. Quand je dis le mot photobook, c'est vraiment l'équivalent du livre d'artiste, mais dans le domaine de la photographie. Des livres qui ont été très très remarqués très vite par les personnes qui s'intéressent aux livres de photographie. Ça l'a fait connaître. Elle a développé une vraie renommée dans le domaine du livre de photographie. Elle a continué à en publier. Puis en 2014, elle a décidé de revenir aux États-Unis, où elle n'avait pas habité pendant presque une dizaine d'années, pour, je dirais, se confronter à son propre pays et à sa propre culture. Elle l'explique souvent comme ça, elle va peut-être en parler ce soir. Et je dirais que le projet qu'elle va présenter ce soir s'inscrit vraiment dans cette dynamique d'une américaine qui se confronte à sa propre culture, et en l'occurrence ce soir à la culture de la masculinité telle qu'elle s'est développée aux États-Unis, je dirais depuis longtemps, puisqu'il y a des hommes aux États-Unis depuis longtemps. Caroline est la lauréate du prix HCB de l'édition 2021. Le jury qui l'a choisi était composé de Christine Barthes, Béatrice Didier, Pierre-Alexis Dumas, Julie Jones, Luce Lebar, François Hebel et Agnès Cyr. Et je tiens personnellement à le remercier pour cet extraordinaire choix. Je suis vraiment très heureux aujourd'hui d'accueillir Caroline à la fois dans les murs avec cette exposition et pour le feuilletage ce soir. Donc je vais lui céder immédiatement la parole. On va faire une discussion qui va durer à peu près 40 minutes et puis ensuite, si vous le voulez bien, on échangera avec la salle. Donc on va commencer la séance. Caroline, the mic is yours.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So this is my new book called Men Untitled, and I think the first thing to start with here is that it directly follows the project and publication called Knit Club, which I also published with the same publisher, TBW Books. And one of the reasons why I chose to work with the same publisher is because I felt I was a little stressed about how this project was going to come together, and I felt comfortable. I felt like I'd be more comfortable working with somebody who knew me well and knew my work. And Paul Sheik at TBW is somebody who I already had kind of developed a relationship with, that we could kind of talk freely to each other and disagree and have arguments and get through them. And I knew that I would need to do that for this project. And also partly because it's kind of thematically a follow-up to Knit Club. Knit Club, if you haven't seen it, I explored ways of photographing a group of women who I had made friends with in a small town in Mississippi. And there's a lot of kind of playing with surrealism and finding ways of looking at womanhood without showing the female body, which is kind of what is more expected when you think of a series about women. And so with this work, I had proposed to the HCB Foundation to turn the camera, go back to the same place, this small town in Mississippi, and turn the camera on some of the men who had actually participated in this project. Had participated in the Knit Club project, but hadn't been made visible in it. And so I started with a man named Bill Beckwith, who's a sculptor. And his image is actually, you can see on the cover here, we chose this image for the cover. As you see more inside of the book, it'll become clear why we have this kind of sculptural image on the cover. But the story behind the image is when he was 21 years old, he decided to get married, and he made a sculpture of his head on a plate that was modeled after his idea of John the Baptist. And so I thought one of the things I was thinking of doing in this work is kind of interrogating things we associate with masculinity. And I thought of this story of Bill's and his head on the platter as a kind of fear of castration because of being tied to a woman. And so, but there's a lot of other layers of meaning that I feel this series of 4 images of his face that are almost exactly the same but slightly different because they're all made from a cast. Somehow, to me, like sculpting and photography has a lot of overlap. As you'll see as we go through the book.
Caroline, sorry to interrupt you. Can you say maybe a few words about the title itself?
Yes. When we first started putting this book together, I wrote down on the front page, we did it on the computer in InDesign, and I started writing title ideas, and there were like 100 or more different ideas, and I just kept them on the first page as possibilities. And I kept changing them and adding to it over time, and at one point we thought we were going to publish the cover with those 100 title ideas on it. So it took us a long time to get to this Men Untitled, but the reason Untitled is there is because I wanted to have some ambiguity to the word men. For one, because it's for the viewer or the reader to decide what kind of men I'm photographing. There's all kinds of men and masculinity and male bodies. And I didn't want to define that for the reader. I kind of wanted them to discover it, what they see. And I also felt like it kind of deflated the power of the word men to use the word untitled. It's kind of like a namelessness, and that's part of what I was hoping to do with this work as well, is kind of reverse the power dynamics within kind of traditional gender relations, and also within traditional gender relations when it comes to photography. And so I can tell you the story of why this dedication page exists when we get halfway through the book, but we dedicated it to Wallace, who is one of the subjects that I photographed. And it says at the bottom, who was promised, in memory of Wallace, who was promised the centerfold, 1957 to 2022. And Wallace, I became friends with him working on this project, and he passed away while I was still working on it, and actually the day before I was supposed to do another photo shoot with him.
Maybe can you say a few words about what is a centerfold Because it's something which is so typical to the American culture.
So the centerfold is well known in the United States as what you see in the middle of Playboy magazine. It's a really polished and beautiful and hot woman who's usually reclining and exposed, and men will bring it into the garage and use the image for their pleasure. So Wallace happens to have, actually, there's the self-portrait of me in the beginning, right here, where I played with Wallace and we traded clothes and we took pictures of each other in each other's clothes. And you can't really see from there, but in the inside of his motorcycle club, the walls and the ceiling are lined with Playboy centerfolds. So he was a big collector of Playboy centerfolds, and we made the joke at one point that I was going to give him, as I started designing the book, I was going to give him the centerfold of the book after we took this picture. And yes, we gave him the centerfold. And what's weird is, yeah, you have to hang it this way. But and we had to crop it a little bit in order to make it the right size for the centerfold. But and in this image, he had told me a story of a girlfriend he had had many years before who they did kinky things. And one example he told me was he liked to hang her upside down on a hook. And he showed me a picture he had taken of when he had done that to her. So I asked him if he would be willing to let me photograph him that way, and he agreed, but he told me he would do it only if I would pose the same way, and so I did, so that I could get him in the centerfold of my book.
And maybe what would be interesting to share with the audience is that the idea of the centerfold is super important in American culture. As you said before, it has been part of this history of representation of women with Playboy and Penthouse and all these men's magazines. But it's also super important in the art history. Someone like Cindy Sherman was deeply interested and made a whole series around the idea of the centerfold. So that's also something which is important in the history of American art, not only American culture.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of interested in interrogating the ways that representations of women and women's bodies have occurred in advertising and in places like Playboy magazine, and also in art history and in the history of photography, and the ways male photographers have also traditionally used their wives or their girlfriends and other women as a muse, and often photographing them reclining on beds or in passive positions. And so in a lot of the pictures in my book, you see the men kind of, the voyeurism reversed, and the woman photographer is kind of looking down at a passive or reclining male. And I guess another thing to point out at the beginning here is there's a lot of different kinds of images in this project. There's these, so in the intro, we have 3 kind of full screen vertical pictures in a row. And that's kind of drawing you in and immersing you in this intimate space of the book. But then after that, they become more, there's mainly smaller pictures that are kind of framed that make you maybe reflect more on the framing of the picture. So at the beginning and the end, I think the reason we made a series of large prints in a row was kind of to pull you in and put you in the mood of the book. And then at the end, we did it again as a kind of grand finale type of thing. But also we started, the opening image is a very kind of prickly, monochromatic color image. And there's a mixture of color and black and white in the book. And some of these monochromatic images I think help kind of create a bridge between the color and the black and white work. And there's also kind of a collection of sculptural kinds of images in the book that are kind of interspersed between the pictures of the people. And they help kind of create a flow. So it's not all, here's all my sculptural images and here's all my portraits, but they're kind of mixed in a kind of poetic flow, or at least that's what we were trying for. And this kind of prickly image introduces you to the idea that I might not, I mean, to me this is kind of violent, it's kind of phallic, it has a potential, it's pointed, you know, and so I think of it almost like a weapon or a kind of threat in a way. And then we go from there to this very intimate image showing the body and a very vulnerable part of the body. And then to the kind of mythological, historical ways that we have thought about men and masculinity. And all three of those things are kind of important parts of the work that kind of flow throughout the book. So that's kind of the introduction. And so I started out photographing people that I knew. Bill Beckwith, who's on the cover, and this is John Davis, a friend that I made while I lived in this town almost 10 years ago now. And I guess I'll get to the, and some of the images, so I started in Mississippi, and eventually a year later I drove back. I mean, I lived there for most of the year working in this town in Mississippi, but eventually I decided to go back to California where I live now and make a whole set of pictures there. And so while I had proposed to make this work about a particular place, kind of masculinity in this particular place in the United States, I ended up deciding to take the question of geography out of the subject matter and focus on these bodies. And because I didn't want the geography and the details of it to distract from looking at these bodies, which is something I realized over time that I had a kind of hang-ups or barriers to having the courage to ask the men to take off their clothes and let me scrutinize their body with the camera. And so I kind of like stripped away the layers of covering and distraction that would allow the viewer to look at things beyond the body, I guess. And then there's also, do you have a question?
No, I was just about asking you a question about these sequences that sometimes appear. Sometimes you have a pair of images or a sequence of images. And I just wanted to ask you, what were you referring to when you were interested in showing two times almost the same image?
Yeah, I think at the very beginning of making this work, I was thinking a lot about Edward Muybridge and the motion sequences he made in the 19th century, that I felt were very much like about defining gender difference. And he was kind of presenting these poses of nude women and nude men in this scientific way, and kind of describing what he thinks, you know, true maleness is and true femaleness is. But sometimes there's these props that are so kind of a value judgment rather than a scientific fact. So like, he thinks women should be photographed with a glass vase pouring water on each other, and men should be photographed fighting with swords. And so I was just kind of thinking about his motion sequences and playing with, you know, how to kind of tweak that idea in my own way. And so The chair is an object Edward Muybridge uses often, I think, in his series. And I played with having this friend of mine, Emile. The chair is also like an object. And so I was kind of looking at the object of Emile's body and the object of the chair. And so you kind of, I had him lift the chair over his head back and forth several times while I took pictures. We're probably still at the beginning, so we should probably hurry up. So I'll just flip through. Also, at one point, I kind of discovered the work of E.J. Belloc, and he has this project called Storyville, which he photographed prostitutes in New Orleans in the 19th century, and I printed out, and they're very beautiful portraits. They actually have like character, even though that women also have this kind of feeling of being exploited or objectified through his viewing. They also have this character that I found in the images, and so I was interested in them because I kind of loved them, but I also hated them. And so I printed out some of his images of the prostitutes and tried to mimic his lighting and the poses that he invited the prostitutes to take. And so this one was modeled after one of those images.
Was it really about trying to reverse the gaze, the male gaze on women, and trying to...
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing it was more about defining as a woman how I wanted to see male bodies. I felt like, and this might not be totally true, but I felt like there's not a really rich history of female representations of the male body. And I wanted to kind of expand that language a little bit. And yeah, I mean, it's a reversal, but it's also kind of wanting to expand the content. And these large color images come back every once in a while, and I think they're partly here to, I mean, I always want to kind of surprise the viewer. Like, I don't want to deliver what you expect to see when you look at masculinity. And I have in my own head like specific literal reasons why I photographed each thing, and the viewer might not know the backstory behind it, but there are reasons why I photographed. I went to the effort of getting an old piano and taking it out into the forest and having some people come and help me burn the piano. To me, because I had read about the piano as I'm still going too slowly, but I had kind of been thinking about the piano as a symbol that was used also, I think, in the 19th century that reinforced gender roles, and like the woman learning how to play the piano for the gentleman, and so that the gentleman would admire her performance. And there are these images of sculpture molds that also recur through the book. And this is the photograph from which we made the cover. So I took his sculptures and took a photograph of it, flattening it, and then for the cover we kind of turned it back into a three-dimensional object. And there's also something about kind of the gaze. Usually the male doesn't return my gaze, and I, having studied a lot of the male gaze, oftentimes that's kind of the way the images are constructed of women, is like the viewer can penetrate the image, but the subject doesn't kind of take back that power. and kind of symbols of virility and masculinity come in every once in a while. The stallion, but he's just, I think fabrics, because in my knit club project, I was thinking a lot about fabrics, and I kind of now have this permanent interest in the way fabric texture plays in photography and in real life, and I guess this is also like a picture of a picture, and kind of the surrealism is another thing that that helps, I think, create surprise and kind of not follow the expectation of what the viewer is going to see.
As you are speaking about surrealism, I would like to introduce an idea which is quite important in your work, which is this idea of a dialectical tension. You always, when you define your way of photographing, you're always in between documentary approach and at the same time is a kind of fictional approach. And I have the feeling that also in your relation with your subjects, you had as a starting point a kind of ambivalence between a lot of anger and also at the same time is a kind of empathy with the people that you were meeting. And so I would love to hear you about this kind of tension between you and your subject in this particular moment in the history of the US.
Yeah, I think, so one of the things about photography that's always drawn me to it is that, and documentary photography, is that often you build relationships through the process of image making that you wouldn't have the opportunity to establish otherwise. And so I get to know people and I feel connected to them as we do a photo shoot and as we do another photo shoot over time, and as I invite people to collaborate and listen to their ideas. And so on the one hand, this was a work where my empathy for my subjects was growing, but on the other hand, I had all this baggage from the history of commerce and art and the politics that was going on in my country that had just created so much anger. And I wanted to use this project as a way to kind of channel that anger into my work rather than just keeping it held inside of me. So I used these people who were becoming my friends to demean them sometimes. Like I posed him as a target in front of a dartboard. And so I would kind of often ask them, I would push them as far as they would be willing to go in ways that were not always, making them look particularly beautiful, and sometimes, posing as a deer on all four legs in the forest. And so I think in the end, the work kind of carries that duality of, on the one hand, empathy, on the other hand, anger, and, anger. That pretty much sums it up. We definitely have to kind of move forward, I guess. And there's these phallic, this is the bottom half of a sculpture mold for a human figure. But the way it comes in the sequence of the book, it kind of appears as a phallic symbol. And so the ambiguity of these sculpture molds I found really interesting, and I took them, and they were actually, all of them belonged to Bill Beckwith, and I took them out of his. I was really interested in the way, looking on the outside, but also on the inside of them, and it's a way of looking at bodies that's kind of makes you remember the illusion of image making that happens when you make images, or when you make a sculpture, or when you make a photograph. You're kind of constructing an illusion. And I think when it comes to gender, that's also one thing I wanted to kind of emphasize, is the idea that it's something we're always molding and building. And I want to kind of create my own idea of what that is, that contrasts with a lot of the history. And we put this image right before the centerfold. I think it kind of helps give more impact to the centerfold. And I already showed you that, but yeah. Let's see. I guess I can just hold up the whole thing. Maybe I should just flip through the rest, and then there's also the ending. There's also kind of, continuing to play with surrealism and a hole in the sand in which I stuck a furry blanket. And in the context of this book, it becomes kind of like an anus, but if it wasn't in the context of this sequence, it might come to mean something else. Most of the men I photographed were older than me. I think I was interested in the long histories that are more easily visible in the bodies of older men, and also because I think the older men had more to expose, were less powerful, and I think I wasn't interested in showing powerful men. And it was also kind of playful at times, daring.
Can you tell us a bit more about
this one?
This one and the situation and who decided to do that? Why do you have a cardboard during the shooting? And tell us a bit more. I love anecdotes, and I would love to hear more about this one.
This is Mike, and he's very proud to be in this show. He's been texting me all week, wanting updates. And when I got back to California, I spent a lot of time finding locations for these shoots, and I wanted spaces that had good natural light, and it was really hard to find that, especially in California. People want to charge you money, but I have a friend who has a store downtown Vallejo, and there's a skylight on the upstairs loft, and so she let me borrow the space, and I invited this guy, Mike, who I met on Craigslist, to do a photo shoot there. And at that point, I had kind of learned to ask people directly if they would be willing to take off their clothes, and Mike was very happy to do that. So I took some pictures of him without his clothes on, and found sometimes I would just pick up props or objects that were lying around whatever space I happened to be working in. And like this wall just happened to be a electrical outlet right under the skylight, so I decided to just keep it as part of the picture. And somehow it speaks in dialogue with his genitals, which are coming through the cardboard. But I think at some point I just got tired of looking at his body, and I felt like I wanted a barrier between us. And so in Jessica's store, she has piles and piles of cardboard that she was going to recycle. And so I just pulled some of the cardboard out of that pile and started playing around with it. And that's how this image arose.
Thank you.
And he's really eager to do another shoot someday. I think at some point I kind of realized, I had this idea that, like, that I always wanted to avoid the penis somehow. Even if somebody was willing to take off their clothes, I would always tell them, oh, turn around a little bit so I could see you from behind. Or it just seemed like their genitals would get in the way. It would kind of be the dominant, dominate the image. But I also felt like I wanted to challenge myself to be able to like look directly at that. So a few times I kind of, I think this is John Tatum. Like I shot some images of him at a distance and then eventually kind of nudged myself closer and closer. There's another motion sequence with a chair. There's also these animal references that weave in and out. And this is the hidden mother image.
I would love to hear more about the hidden mother. It's also part of a photographic tradition, and maybe we need some more explanation and background about this.
Yeah, there have been some publications coming out recently in which some women photographers kind of study this phenomenon from the 19th century where mothers would go to a photo studio to have their children photographed. And in order to kind of keep the child comfortable and under control, they would be present holding the child and cover themselves with a piece of fabric so that their face and body wouldn't be visible in the photograph. And so...
And it was mainly made in tintype, ferrotype, and it was super popular at the end of the 19th century. And recently, because of eBay, a lot of these tintype were become on sale, and a lot of collectors were completely fascinated with that type of photograph at a moment where, especially in France, we are talking a lot about veils and things like that. And it became super popular. Some artists started collecting these hidden mother. The word hidden mother became something well known. It was the way to search them on eBay. And artists like Laura Larson, but also Cindy Sherman was super interested in that. Cindy Sherman again were super interested in that. And maybe I would love to hear why you decided to replace the mother by maybe a father, or in any case a man.
I mean, he's not a father, but I think just putting men in the positions that women were traditionally put in. There was a certain degree of reversal that I was experimenting with. To see what would happen and what it would look like, because I just felt like there's no reason other than patriarchy and misogyny that would create the need for women to be in certain positions and men to be in other positions historically. And it's a bit of a demeaning and weakening pose, obviously. He can't breathe, he can't see what I'm doing. So to see how men experience being in that position. This is Angelo. It's my dog Mango, another animal, and he's a boy. This is Bill with a muse, a beautiful woman that was a subject of one of his artworks. And I think we're approaching the end here. This is Bill with a corset mannequin that he had bought. And I asked him to expose his midriff alongside this corset mannequin that emphasized unnatural lines of femaleness. And I think the sneakers on the head is what made this one work. it just kind of interrupts your ability to have any voyeuristic pleasure from looking at this man. And so here, the last three pictures are also large, printed at large scale again. This is a kind of beheading position that we named after Caravaggio, and the man in fetal position. And then we have this list of titles at the very end on the last page, which also I kind of lined up in this long phallic column, which we also put on the back of the book to kind of balance the white on the front. And then hidden on the back flap, we have...
Hidden again.
Yeah. I mean, I think so there's a text written by me in the back, and part of the reason why I think it needed to be hidden in the end rather than printed in the book was it's quite personal, and it's a little bit different than the text that appears on the wall in the show, and it's kind of a chronology of things that I was reflecting on about my own personal history as a woman as I was making this work, and some of the things that were making me angry as the Me Too movement was happening, and I kind of was remembering some things from my past that I had never allowed myself to be angry about. And so I kind of decided to write them out here. I'll read you the first, it's a kind of a list. I'll read you the first item on the list. It'll give you a picture of kind of where it goes. I'm a teenager sunbathing alone on the beach. A man with a camera arrives above me, asks if he can take my picture, then proceeds to spread suntan lotion on my legs, then between my thighs. I don't know how to say no. And there's kind of the stories evolved from there.
Thank you, Caroline. That's super interesting to go through the book with you. I really appreciate the way you were talking about the book and the image without being able to show them to the public. And so thank you so much. Maybe we should take a few questions from the audience. Si vous avez des questions, je vais faire passer le micro. N'hésitez pas à interroger Caroline sur son projet.
You mentioned that you wanted to, in your hidden mother image, see how men reacted in these same instances that women had. How did they?
Well, John, the guy in that photograph, I think the only picture he really liked that I took of him was one in which he actually looks strong. It's the one of him covered in mud in a pond. Like he resisted a lot of the things that I asked him to do, but he really wanted to be in the book. But he told me I think he thought it was, a lot of them were strange and not how he would depict himself, but the one of him in the mud was the only one that I think he really liked. But you know, like Bill on the cover, like he kind of decided he understands my need to demean men and put them in demeaning positions, and so he thinks he deserves it, and so therefore he wasn't willing to take all his clothes off, but he was willing to like put a C-clamp on his belly and have me photograph him tightening it and loosening it. So it was different people responded in different ways. Some of the men just really wanted me to look at their penis, and I found that like when I talk to my female friends or just in general, like I use the word penis if I want to talk about that part of the male body, but I found that almost all of the men I talked with about this, they feel like offended by the word penis, and they'd rather use dick or cock. So that was another thing I learned in this project.
It seems like this book oscillates between what we think of as like heteronormative standards of masculinity with like little touches of vulnerability or or fragility or like tenderness maybe. And you said that it seems like the activating impulse around this book is anger, which is, maybe that's incorrect. Well, you used that word yourself, which seems very valid to me, especially if you're exploring the American South. But I'm wondering, since so many of these images were the product of these ongoing relationships with these men, if there were moments either that, like moments, just internal moments where you felt like your expectations around masculinity were complicated or upended in some way.
Yeah, I think I still have complicated and confused feelings about the idea of masculinity and you know, confused feelings about my relationships with men, because I'm angry. I have anger at a lot of the men in my life, and it's not necessarily because of how they behave. It's because of bigger things that I carry with me. And sometimes it is about how they behave, because I see men, you know, reinforcing stereotypes I have about, you know, I think the word mansplaining has become very popular in the past 5 years or so. And I encounter that all the time. And I encounter the opposite of that a lot of times with women. And so I think I've become more aware of those differences and behavior, like subtle aspects of behaviors where people are reinforcing stereotypes I have, but yeah, I think men are human. Men age and men die. So their power is not, the power of the individual people does not last forever, but maybe because the power of like misogynistic systems does get perpetuated over generations, that makes my anger continue. But yeah, I have a very complicated relationship with men.
So my question is related to the exhibition. There's a chapter where there are more self-portraits of you, and with these wallpapers, with the book on womanhood, I don't know, from the 50s. So it's not included in the book. Is it a project that you developed right after the series and the book, or it's something that you finally realized that didn't have its place in the book? Could you tell something about this?
Yeah, that work is something I was actually starting to produce while I was writing the proposal for this. And I think I had proposed to photograph myself. I mean, there's I have masculine qualities myself, so I was imagining, as I would kind of be thinking about male bodies or masculinity and kind of being around that I would identify the qualities of myself that kind of fit into that category. Because I do think of myself as someone who's kind of fluid, and you know, I have female body parts, but I also have aspects of my body there that are very masculine. And so I was gonna photograph, and I did photograph myself in these kind of gender bending poses, but it didn't fit into this book. And I have the plan, and it's still in progress. And my plan is to publish a book, keep shooting that, and publish that as a separate book within the context of the Glorify Self, your book, which is on the wallpaper in the middle of the exhibition. And I think, well, you know, the book uses this centerfold as a kind of structuring. It gives a kind of structure to their narrative. It helps, I think, the idea of the centerfold helps the viewer read the work as a kind of attempt to interrogate like misogyny or like traditional ways of depicting female bodies. And in the exhibition, instead of the centerfold, we have this self-portrait work. So I think the self-portraits in the show create a dialogue with the photographs of men in the way that the book uses the centerfold.
You said you took older men than your age, and I was wondering whether you thought it was going to be more complicated to do with younger bodies, than it would reference other stuff than the one we see in your book, or?
Well, I think partly I did photograph, I mean, there are a few photographs of younger men, but I found that in some of the photo shoots I did with the younger men, their bodies are so beautiful, and it was hard to get beyond beauty in the images that I was making. And the fragility was hard for me to see. So that's probably the main two reasons why I mostly stayed away from young men. And I think young men are aware of their beauty. I found, like, they're fully, the men I photographed, you know, I think the older men knew that they're fragile, and that came out in the pictures more than with the younger men. And I didn't want men who are full of themselves, you know, like, so I think that was part of it.
It could fuel your anger. That was the...
Yeah.
You spoke a bit about what you've learned photographing naked men. And so I would love to hear from you what you learned through the whole process of this project. What was the added value of this whole project?
I mean, I think it was a really, like, learning how to develop a language for a particular subject, learning how to shift my language based on what I was feeling about the subject. And I had come out of this knit club project, and I had to really reverse my language. And it took me a long time to get there. But I think the idea of establishing a language that works for that subject is really challenging and really important to me.
Photographic language.
Yeah.
How would you define it compared to what you've done for the knit club or for the previous project? How different is it?
Well, in knit club, there was a lot of trying to create identity by looking at things other than the body. And in this work, I was trying to look at the bodies and see what it's like to objectify them, and how I felt about that, and how the guys felt about that. So the language, you know, it removed geography. That was probably one of the biggest things. And, you know, it's a body of it's a language about body.
Interesting.
And also, I mean, it's really, a lot of times I work on a project for 8 years, and I just kind of, I mean, I enjoy developing a project in different chapters, and, you know, the project I'm doing at home in Vallejo, I started as a street photographer and meeting strangers on the street, and it evolved into this project where I'm making textile pieces using found photographs. And so I enjoy like allowing my ideas to change and evolve through time, but the kind of challenge of meeting a deadline, like in 2 years you have to make a whole new body of work. Like I think I learned about committing myself to one project and also saying no to things that are distracting from where I should be spending my time. Like learning how to say no in the photography world is also kind of an important lesson I learned.